How is it nearly the end of October already? Like, there's like 4 days left. But that means it's 4 days till Halloween. So, that being said, hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and I paint crap on my face. I currently look like this, which can only mean one thing. We're talking myths, monsters, and makeup. We are back with another video for Monsters, Myths and Makeup, which is a little series that I have on my channel where I do some kind of makeup look inspired by a particular monster or myth, and whilst doing so I rattle off endless amounts of random information about said monster and or myth. Obviously we are still in Halloween, so today is going to be another spooky season special. Although it's actually going to be the last spooky season special of this year, at least. I am going to be continuing this series, just putting that straight out there. I will just be going back to, like, less Halloween-specific topics. So, on that note, if you have any requests or any particular monsters or myths that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments down below, because I'm starting to plan out the next videos that I want to get done. So if there's any that you particularly want to see, let me know. We're leaning again less into the monster side of things and much more into the mythology and kind of a bit of like superstition, because as you will have probably seen from the thumbnail, today we are looking at the mythology and legend and lore surrounding black cats. Now obviously black cats are real, they are a thing, but obviously during my research into Halloween for ideas for looks, and obviously the first video that I did about Halloween itself, there was loads of like iconography and various things that were associated with the holiday and the spooky season. Obviously one of which is the black cat. It's kind of synonymous with it, especially in relation to like witches and witchcraft. They're very, very closely associated. And it kind of got me thinking about like where that association came from. During my research, I also discovered that today is National Black Cat Day. So, not to be confused with National Black Cat Appreciation Day, which is August 17th. No, today is National Black Cat Day. I thought it would be quite fitting to kind of look into this whole mythology aspect and unearth why there are these like superstitions and stuff associated with black cats. And, you know, I can kind of semi-promote National Black Cat Day while I'm doing it, because if you don't know, National Black Cat Day is basically a day to try and dispel all of the negative myths and superstitions that tend to follow black cats, i.e. the idea that they're unlucky or associated with witches and witchcraft and like all that kind of crap. And it's a way of trying to promote the adoption of black cats from shelters and things like that, because unfortunately not that long ago, and for many places, black cats were usually the last to be adopted from shelters and pet shops and that kind of thing. A, because of all these weird superstitions and theories and myths surrounding them. The second reason was because they apparently don't photograph as well as other coloured cats, which, if you're picking an animal for a pet based on how well you can take a photograph of them, gonna be honest, don't think you should be getting a pet. Before I get too sidetracked and waffle on for too much longer, let me go and get myself prepped and then we can start. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will link all of the products that I use in the description box down below. I'm aware that my eyes are currently two different colours right now because of the contacts. It's because I have a different contact to put in this eye that I cannot see out of, so I'm going to change that one out at the end. So black cats. I personally absolutely adore black cats. I have owned black cats in the past. I even have like a tiny little tattoo of a black cat in honour of one of those black cats that I owned. Yeah, I appreciate everyone has personal preferences with pets and things like that, blah blah blah. But why would you not want like a tiny little panther running around your house? But that's beside the point. Now, black cats do have a lot of superstition attached to them. In particular, the idea of them being bad luck, whether it's owning one, seeing one, crossing paths with one. It's a very common superstition. And a very, very old one as well. Unfortunately, there is a real-life impact in that, generally speaking, black cats are the last to be adopted from shelters. So, I started looking into sort of where this superstition in particular came from, because especially in some cultures, black cats are the opposite, and that they're actually considered good luck, and they're often a sign of wealth and prosperity. Now, the origins of black cats especially being seen as, like, bad omens seems to stem from sometime during the Middle Ages, or Medieval Ages, whichever one you want to call it. Because up until that point, black cats, and just cats in general, were often seen as a good sign, to the extent that they were worshipped in places like ancient Egypt. Now, the Egyptians worshipped cats for a number of different reasons, and they often honoured them with gold and jewels and good food, special burials, that kind of thing, but black cats in particular were seen as a sign of good luck. It was fairly common practice in ancient Egypt for basically every household to have a pet cat. They were incredibly practical and very useful to have around. Generally speaking, they could look after themselves, and they were very skilled hunters, which obviously helped get rid of pests. In particular, they were praised for their ability to get rid of things like venomous snakes. So they were often seen as like protectors and guardians, as well as very fierce predators, and it was believed that they offered protection to the home from sort of evil spirits as well. And this was in part due to the fact that the ancient Egyptians believed that cats possessed sort of divine energy. They didn't see cats as gods, but believed that the gods could inhabit cats, which is why a lot of deities have like cat-like features to them. But it's also the reason why they were honoured with gifts and jewels and good meals and special burials. It was a way of honouring this energy and served as a reminder for the power of these gods. There's a collection of ancient funeral texts from ancient Egypt that has been sort of collectively given the name the Book of the Dead, and it consisted of a number of like magic and spells that were used to assist a dead person's journey to the underworld and the afterlife, and it was compiled by like various priests and written over like the course of about 1,000 years. Now, this book indicated that cats were actually a representative of the ancient Egyptian deity of the sun, Ra, who is in some cases arguably like one of the most important gods within ancient Egyptian mythology. And this association of cats with this god indicated that cats had a sort of protective function within Egyptian mythology and Egyptian beliefs. Alongside this, and possibly another reason why cats were sort of revered so much and associated with this particular solar deity, is obviously Egyptians worshipped a lot to do with the sun. The sun deity was the most important. And obviously cats are known for basking in sunlight and sunspots. And oftentimes, if you ever see a cat lying in the sunlight, obviously the colour of their fur can like shift and change, especially black cats. If you see black cats in sunlight, they often take on a kind of like almost a red hue to them, which obviously was a very important colour to the Egyptians because of the association with the sun. And obviously Egyptians had a number of deities that had cat-like features, or just as far as cat heads. Quick disclaimer, because I forgot to mention it at the beginning again. Obviously looking at other cultures, other languages, especially ancient cultures, there's a lot of really tricky words and names, so I will try my best to get the pronunciations right, but I'm just going to apologise in advance for any that I get wrong. As always, please do feel free to let me know how they should actually be pronounced if I do get them wrong. I found reference to a number of deities that had cat-like heads, one of which was the goddess Maftet, who was the goddess of justice, or like legal justice. Some people believe she was the goddess of like capital punishment, but she protected the sun god Ra from venomous snakes and scorpions, and she wore the skin of a cheetah as her head. Another one that I saw was the goddess Sekhmet, who was a warrior goddess, as well as actually being the daughter of the sun god Ra. She was also considered to be the goddess of medicine as well, so I found that a lot of Egyptian... It's the same with Greece, actually. A lot of, like, ancient deities had, like, multiple things that they were gods or goddesses of. I found some reference that she was said to be quite a cruel and sort of vengeful goddess who could breathe fire and cause plagues, but she was depicted with the head of a lioness. Now, the goddess most commonly associated with cats specifically is the goddess Bastet. Now, she was actually often associated with Sekhmet as well. In some instances, they were characterised as basically being like two aspects of the same goddess, just under two slightly different titles, with Sekhmet being the fierce, protective warrior with the lioness's head, and Bastet later being depicted with the head of a black cat, representing the more sort of gentle side. Because although Bastet was still a fierce warrior in her own right, She was known for being the goddess of protection from illness and evil spirits, and through the association with the cats, and obviously cats having a fairly high fertility rate, she was also known as the goddess of pregnancy and childbirth. Now, alongside their association with, like, the gods and divine energy, cats were also very often depicted in art and fashion and, like, home decor throughout ancient Egypt. And cats were treated with so much respect that it was forbidden to kill a cat. And anyone who did, even if it was an accident, they were sentenced to death. And that respect for the cat continued after they died as well. They were mummified, given very elaborate burials, often buried with their owners or their families, and apparently people would shave off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning when their cat died. So obviously back then, the ancient Egyptians associated cats with gods and deities and divine energy, whereas nowadays they're more often associated with witches and witchcraft. So I started trying to follow this up to work out why, when, and sort of how this shift occurred, which then led me to ancient Greece. Again. So characters from ancient Greece in particular included Artemis, who was the goddess of the hunt, but she was also considered the goddess of the wilderness, wild animals, nature, childbirth, the moon, and forests. I'm pretty sure there was a few other things that she was associated with as well, but those were like the main 6 or 7. Now, Artemis was actually very often linked with the Egyptian goddess Bastet because she had the ability to transform herself into any animal, and there was one particular instance when she transformed herself into a cat. Now, the instance that she transformed herself into a cat was during the war between Typhon and the gods. If you saw my video on Medusa, you will know that Typhon was this just big, bad, sea monster-y creature, but like the biggest and the baddest of all big bad things within ancient Greece. So he went to war with the gods, the Olympians, under Zeus's rule, and whilst Artemis fought in the battle alongside many of the other Olympians, Zeus ordered all of them to like flee to Egypt because basically he was like, yeah, we've got no chance against this thing right now. So all of the Olympians turned themselves into animals in order to escape, and Artemis very famously turned herself into a cat. Now, Artemis is also very closely linked with the goddess Hecate, I believe it's pronounced, who was considered the goddess of crossroads, magic, spells, witchcraft, and again, the moon. Now, similar to Bastet and Sekhmet, there are some theories that Artemis and Hecate are two aspects of the same goddess. And it was after Artemis was like adopted into the Olympian pantheon, she would have become more associated with things like purity and maidenhood, because Artemis was known as one of the virgin goddesses. So her originally like slightly darker associations with things like magic and the night would have been worshipped separately under the title of Hecate. I found quite a few other myths regarding these two particular goddesses, one of which was that Artemis saved someone called Iphigenia, who I believe was Agamemnon's daughter. But basically Artemis saved her from being sacrificed and then transformed her into Hecate. But there is some debate on whether Hecate existed before this, and whether or not Iphigenia becomes Hecate or becomes part of Hecate if she already existed, if that makes sense. Now, the whole reason for going down this little tangent is that Hecate was said to have kept a black cat as a pet and a familiar who would assist her with spells and witchcraft and magic, which forms a lot of the origins for black cats being associated with witchcraft. Or at least some people believe that's where a lot of the origins for the black cat witchcraft thing came from. Because I obviously looked into it a lot, and the more I looked into it, I found a lot of very conflicting information on it. Because Hecate was actually often depicted and very closely associated with a female dog rather than a cat. And this was most likely due to the dog's connection to birth and fertility. And in some cases, it was believed that this dog was her familiar. And in fact, in some versions, the dog itself even has like an origin story where it was originally the Trojan queen, Hecuba, who leapt into the sea after the fall of Troy, and then Hecate transformed her. But in relation to the cat familiar, I found a lot of references to a tale of someone called Galinthius. You're going to have to bear with me on this because I'm about to throw a whole lot of names and it's about to get real confusing, but just try and stick with me. Galantheus was believed to be sort of a maiden and companion to Alcmene, who went on to become the mother of Heracles, who was fathered by Zeus. So the story goes that as Alcmene was in labour with Heracles, there were 3 sisters who were known as the Morai. Basically, they were like the personification of destiny. They were sometimes referred to as like the Fates. And there were also the Aletheia, who were known as like the birth goddesses. Now, between these 3 sisters of fate and destiny and the birth goddesses, they prevented Alcmene from giving birth, keeping her in labour, or what was referred to as birth pangs. Now, they did this as a favour to Hera, who was Zeus's wife. Oh no, sorry, Zeus's sister wife, because Greek mythology. And also because Greek mythology, there seems to be a recurring theme of women being punished and cursed and whatever for the behaviour of men. Look at the case of Medusa. She was punished because Poseidon forced himself on her, and here, Hera decided to keep Alcmene in the middle of labour because Zeus couldn't keep it in his pants. Which, let's face it, you married to Zeus, like, it's a very known fact that the dude banned, like, the entirety of ancient Greek civilization at this point. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Now, Galantheus was worried that being kept in this, like, prolonged state of labour would just send Alcmene mad, which, fair. Now, the 3 sisters and the birth goddesses during this whole thing had remained seated with their arms firmly crossed, preventing Alcmene from progressing through her labour. Now, Galantheus ran up to them and basically announced that, as part of Zeus's will, Alcmene had given birth to a baby boy, which kind of rendered their interference as null and void. This then led to the 3 sisters of fate letting go of their arms, at which point Alcmene's labour then ended and Heracles was born. Now, the 3 fate sisters and the birth goddesses were particularly angry about this, because they, as gods, had been deceived by Galantheus, who was immortal. So they then proceeded to transform Galantheus into a black cat in appearance as punishment. Now, Hecate felt sorry for Galantheus for having her appearance changed like this, so she ended up appointing her as like a sacred servant to herself, to then assist her with magic and spell work, that kind of thing. There are some variations on this particular tale that state Galantheus was actually like a maiden and servant to Hera herself, who then cursed Galantheus directly for interfering with her interference of Heracles' birth. Now, this would, in theory, then make perfect sense as to why black cats would be associated with witchcraft years down the line, especially as in this case the black cat was only a black cat in appearance, so could still kind of communicate and think like the person they were beforehand, which also links to the idea of like the black cat familiar and the concept of witches being able to transform into black cats. So it all links up, except that it doesn't. Because the more I looked into it, the more I struggled to find any kind of official historical records of this black cat story, specifically in relation to it being a black cat that Galantheus was transformed into. In every other reference and iteration that I found, she was transformed into a polecat, or a weasel basically, as a reflection of her deceitfulness. There was an additional detail of her transformation into this weaselly polecat thing that the Sisters of Fate very specifically included, which I will apologise for in advance, because while she is a polecat in appearance, she is still Galantheus, but they transformed her in such a way that she was forced to mate as this animal, but in a really awful way, and not at all how nature intended for a weasel or polecat to mate. It was said that in order for her to mate as this animal, she had to be mounted in the ear, and she then basically gave birth by throwing up her young, which, grim. I mean, I guess that's what you get for pissing off several different, very powerful gods. So based on this, it's much more accurate to say that weasels and polecats were more commonly associated with Hecate, rather than cats. I wonder if gradually over time people just kind of stopped understanding what a polecat was and dropped the pole and just referred to it as cat, and then that's where it came from. Because I'll be honest, I had to look up what a polecat was because I didn't know. Now, whilst in that particular story, Hecate takes pity on someone who gets transformed into a polecat, there is yet another tale in which Hecate herself transforms someone into a polecat. Now, in this case, it's in reference to a minor character in Greek mythology known as Gale, who was a very skilled witch who dealt in like herbs and potions. However, she was described as being extremely lascivious, which is basically an unnecessarily complicated word for like lusty or horny or lewd. And she was said to have abnormal sexual desires. However, most of those were not described in any kind of detail, so I don't know what said abnormal desires were. Now, I'm not one to kink shame, but apparently her desires were abnormal enough that she then incurred the wrath of Hecate, who transformed her into a polecat. Now, in the stories that I read, polecat and weasel were like interchangeable, and apparently weasels especially were actually thought to have a certain level of like magical potency in ancient Greece, but not necessarily like the beneficial kind, but it's another reason that they are often associated with Hecate. So if the Greek mythology of witches and black cats is actually not that accurate, where did the association come from? And for that, we have to fast forward to Europe in the Middle Ages. I know the majority of this side of my face looks boring as hell right now compared to some of the other looks that I've done, and it's honestly giving me very 2016 vibes. Please bear with me because I'm hoping this will all kind of tie together at the end. But yes, Europe, Middle Ages. Up until sort of the 13th century, cats were very highly valued for a lot of the same like practical reasons that they were valued in ancient Egypt, i.e. hunting skills and sort of natural pest control. They were kept to protect like stores of grain from rats and mice, and they were the only animals that were allowed inside monasteries for the same reason. And a lot of religious texts and manuscripts feature cats chasing or eating mice. They were actually so highly valued for this that an adult cat would actually fetch the same price as a fully grown sheep, a goat, or an untrained house dog, and a kitten was given the same value as like a piglet or a lamb. Now, written records of cats being linked to like the occult, and especially black cats, date as far back as the 13th century, and for that we can thank Pope Gregory IX, who in 1233 issued an official church document that declared all cats needed to be killed, and that black cats especially were an incarnation of Satan. Now, this particular declaration had incredibly far-reaching effect, and it essentially marked the beginning of the Inquisition and the church-backed witch hunts, which were apparently initially designed in order to try and stop the growing cults of Luciferians in Germany, but then it quickly spread across Europe. Now, in this particular context as well, witches were believed to be pre-Christian pagan practitioners. And whilst the early church did sort of coexist with witches in Europe for a set amount of time, similar to what happened with the pagan festival of Samhain, as the church grew in sort of popularity and gained power, they saw witches as their direct competition in gaining like the hearts and minds and beliefs of the people, which is when the church then began hunting and torturing, persecuting and killing witches in vast numbers. This is kind of giving Batman right now. Or Catman. I will see myself up. Now, witches, especially with their association with pagans and pagan practices, were known for honouring the natural world, having a deep respect for plants and animals and wildlife, which led to any kind of affection between humans and animals being sort of marked by the church as like diabolical and devilish. So very quickly, the little old lady who lived with a bunch of cats soon became a suspected threat to the church. Now, as well as witches and devils, the other aspects of cats in particular that made them a target for the church was that the early church saw them as a threat and feared them because of their behaviour and their mannerisms. Think of a cat, a typical cat. Generally speaking, they are very independent, they're self-sufficient, and, you know, in some cases they're kind of aloof almost. They don't necessarily respect authority, and in some instances they could be seen as having actually an outright disrespect for authority. I mean, have you tried telling a cat what to do? Like, they don't listen. Their independence and self-sufficiency was part of what they were celebrated for in places like ancient Egypt. However, these kinds of traits were similar to the traits of women who were accused of being witches. And as far as the church were concerned, neither an independent woman nor an independent animal would be tolerated. Another reason that black cats in particular became so heavily associated with witches and witchcraft was for a much more logical and practical reason. All the women who were accused of witchcraft did have cats as pets, and a lot of them did have black cats as pets for the practical reason that black cats made better hunters because they hunt at night and it's harder to see a black cat at night. They were more successful in hunting mice and rodents and pests, so that was why they were more often kept. On that note though, there was a very unexpected and rather unfortunate side effect of Pope Gregory's declaration, because where he basically decreed that not only black cats but all cats should be killed, it did mean that the number of cats that were around did significantly decrease. Now, with fewer cats around, who were revered and kept for their rodent hunting abilities, there was a huge increase in the rat population. And what were rats known for carrying during the Middle Ages? The Black Plague. You ordered everyone to kill the rat catchers, and now there's loads of rats. Insert shocked Pikachu face. The spread of the Black Plague across Europe was estimated to have killed around 50 million people, which was roughly 60% of Europe's population at that time. And obviously a lot of people know about the whole, they thought it was in the air, so they set bonfires, they didn't realise it was coming from the rats thing. I knew that, I remember learning about that at school. But I didn't know that it was basically because there was a shortage of cats because of the church that led to an increase in rats that then contributed to the spread of the plague. And it's believed that had Pope Gregory not issued that decree, then the cats would have significantly reduced the numbers and millions of lives could have been saved. Now, going back to the whole association with witches and the witch hunt and the trials, that kind of thing, there was a book published in 1584 called Beware the Cat, which was one of the first to allude to the idea of a cat having 9 lives, which, according to this book, was the number of times a witch could take on the form of a cat. And the idea of them being able to transform into a cat in the first place is, again, most likely from the fact that a lot of the women who were accused of being a witch had cats as pets. Another possible origin for the concept of cats having 9 lives and the witches transforming into cats comes from Celtic mythology. It's basically the same concept, but the book was the first written sort of confirmation of this idea. So going into Celtic mythology, we are once again going back to Ireland and Scotland, but more predominantly in Scotland rather than Ireland this time. The Irish and the Celts, just that whole area, they had some crazy mythology, man. But anyway, within the Scottish Highlands particularly, there is a creature known as the Ketchie. Now, this was considered a fairy creature, and it resembled a large black cat with a white spot on its chest. Now, the legends of this creature have that it haunts the Scottish Highlands, and whilst it is considered a fairy creature, there are some sort of common localised folklore stories that suggest the Ketchie is actually a witch that could transform into a cat 9 times, but if she chose to go back into a cat for that 9th time, she would then remain a cat for the rest of her life. Now, this mythology was really interesting because the people of the Scottish Highlands did not trust this cat, or this cat spirit or witch, whichever one it is, because it was apparently believed that this creature could steal a person's soul before it was claimed by the gods once they died. and they did so by passing over a body before it was buried. And they believed this and distrusted this creature so much that people would keep watch night and day in what was known as late wakes in order to keep the spirit away from the body before it was buried. And there were loads of methods of distraction that were used, and this included things like games and leaping around, wrestling, catnip, music, riddles, basically anything to keep the Ketchi away from the body, or at least away from the room that the body was in. And they also made sure that there was no fires near where the body lay, because it was said that the Ketchi was attracted to the warmth. Which is fair, because cats do like warmth. Now, the Ketchi was also linked to the pagan festival of Samhain, and it was a practice to leave a saucer of milk outside your house for the Ketchi to drink. The belief being that any household who did this, the Ketchi would bless them. However, any household who did not leave out a saucer of milk, the Ketchi would then curse that household to have all of their cows' udders dry up. The actual legend of this creature may have been inspired by the Scottish wildcat, especially the Kellas cat, which is like a hybrid between a Scottish wildcat and a domestic cat. And the Kellas cat in particular was genuinely believed to be a mythological creature up until 1984, when a gamekeeper managed to kill one in like a snare and presented it. When they reported that they'd killed this creature, suddenly all these farmers and gamekeepers came forward saying that they'd been hunting these big black cats in the Scottish Highlands for years. Fun, slightly more light-hearted little side note, there's a British folk tale called The King of the Cats, which I kind of love. Basically, a man comes home to his wife and his cat, who is called Old Tom, and he tells them that he saw 9 black cats with a little white spot on their chest carrying a coffin with a crown on it. And one of the cats turned to him and told him to tell Tom Tildrum that Tim Toldrum is dead. The cat, Old Tom, then exclaims, "What? Old Tim is dead? Then I'm the king of the cats," before climbing up the chimney and never being seen again. I don't know what it is about that tale that just... it's really dumb. It makes me smile quite a lot, I can't lie. Now again, going back to the whole Middle Ages witch hunt thing, the first widely documented witch trial in Britain was in 1566 in the Essex area, and it was against 4 women: Laura Winchester, Elizabeth Francis, Agnes Waterhouse, and her daughter Joan. Now, it was said that Elizabeth confessed to being taught witchcraft by her grandmother when she was 12 years old, and her grandmother actually gave her a cat who was called Sathan, and it was said that she had given her blood to the devil in the form of this cat, which she kept in a little basket and fed and looked after. She apparently confessed to using the cat as a kind of vessel to work some of her simple but harmful magic, and she then rewarded it with chickens and droplets of her own blood. Along this note, Sathan was apparently responsible for the death of a man who had gotten Elizabeth pregnant but then refused to marry her. Now, 15 years later, this cat, Sathan, was passed on to Elizabeth's sister, Agnes, where he apparently continued on his evil rampage, causing the death of lots of geese and cows and other livestock. Now, there were numerous trials for Elizabeth and her family. If I remember correctly, Elizabeth was found not guilty because she basically confessed and kind of threw these other women under the bus. Agnes was sentenced and then executed. Joan, her daughter, was found not guilty. I didn't really see anything about what happened to Laura Winchester or how she was kind of related to all of them, so if you know anything about that, please let me know, because I'm really curious. But obviously during these trials, the cat, Sathan, was basically used as a bit of a scapegoat for various misfortunes and deaths that happen within the area. Now, alongside being used as the scapegoat for all these problems and misfortunes, sensationalized stories about the whole trial began to spread throughout Britain, which reinforced this negative reputation that cats had started to gain, thanks to the church, and this idea of an evil familiar or a spirit in the form of an animal. And given this association, it's believed that this is where the superstition developed, surrounding it being bad luck if a black cat crosses your path. I want to try and add some like fur texture to this. The method that I'm thinking of using may just completely ruin the whole thing. Okay, I ended up doing that completely off camera, so I do apologise. I think I've managed to add a bit more texture and like depth to it, but it's too late for me to go back on it now anyway, so I'm going back to the idea of black cats being bad luck if you cross paths with them. So the fear that was being generated by the church, along with the sensationalised stories that were coming from witch hunts and witch trials, it led to the fear that a black cat crossing your path could very well be on a mission for a witch, or it could even be the devil in disguise. And obviously crossing paths with the devil was not really something you wanted to do. So black cats started becoming this bad omen. The idea continued and developed a lot, to the extent that peasants believed crossing paths with a black cat may very well have been a witch's familiar who had been sent in order to hurt them. So as a result, they may have then hurried off to the nearest church that they could find, and then paid the priest to bless them and rid them of any curses that the cat might have put on them. And obviously with this now developing into a potential source of income for the church, it was very likely that these fears were then encouraged and reinforced by them. Now, whilst it seems to have originated in Europe, the fear of black cats in particular did eventually make its way across the Atlantic, most likely thanks to the Puritan colonists in the 1600s, which is partly why the superstition of a black cat is so negative in America, whereas in other countries it's actually the opposite. Now, despite all of the witch trials, in England black cats are said to bring joy and prosperity to newlyweds, symbolising a long and happy marriage, and was said to actually make quite a fortuitous wedding gift. There was an article in 1927 about a bride-to-be who saw a black cat sitting on the steps of the church the morning of her wedding. She then saw another one at the door to the hotel, the hall, and the reception, just constantly seeing black cats throughout the entirety of her wedding day. Fun little side story actually, I went to a wedding years ago, and it was at this really big, very private venue that was kind of in the middle of nowhere, didn't really have neighbours or anything like that, and whilst we were there, I found a cat, this little black and white cat, really, really cute, lovely, who then just stayed with me for the entire night. There's photos of me sitting just with this cat on my lap for most of the evening. Now, the venue did not have a cat, and they didn't have any neighbours nearby who had a cat. The hotel staff had never seen the cat before, and it was a very odd thing for them. But yeah, I spent the entire wedding with a cat. On a nice note with that though, the couple are still happily married and they have 2 children now. Black cats are actually quite often seen as good omens in the eyes of sailors and fishermen as well. And the wives of English fishermen often kept black cats in their homes as tokens of luck to ensure their husbands would return safely from sea. And similarly, sailors would often aim to try and have a black cat on board as a ship's cat for good fortune and good weather while they were sailing, as well as a way of warding off evil spirits and offering protection. This belief in particular actually became so popular that the price of black cats absolutely skyrocketed. Within the folklore of France, there's a creature known as the matagot, or mandagot, that takes the form of an animal, usually a black cat. And an aspect of this folklore is known as the magician cat, and a certain aspect of this folklore is known as the magician cat, which is said to bring wealth to the home if it's well fed. Traditionally, you would lure a wealth-bringing matagot back to your home by using a fresh plump chicken was the preferred method. You would then have to carry it home without looking back. Then, as long as the cat is given a warm bed to sleep in and the first bite of every meal and drink, it would then repay the owner with a single gold coin every morning. I never realised this, but matagots are actually even included within the Harry Potter universe, and they were used by the French Ministry of Magic for various handiwork and security. I think it was part of the Fantastic Beasts side aspect of Harry Potter. I do not remember them being referenced in the films or the books at all, so I don't know where they came into it, but they're in there. Now, around the same time as the witch hunts in Europe, if you went over to the east, to Japan, during what was known as the Edo period, there were some superstitions that black cats could cure tuberculosis. The iconic fortune cat, known as the Maneki Neko, I think it's pronounced, obviously brings good luck and sort of life successes, but black fortune cats are also believed to ward off demons and evil spirits and actually stalkers as well. There's also a similar belief to the English one about black cats and like happy marriages, in that a single woman in Japan can attract a number of male suitors, and not just any, but like the fine, attractive kind, if she keeps a black cat. So basically the whole superstition surrounding black cats and whether they're good luck or bad luck just depends entirely on where you go and which law you choose to follow. Now, I think I may have actually timed this perfectly because I only have like the little finishing touches left to do and I'm basically done with my stories. So let me just go finish this off real quick and then we can round it all off. I think this is the most comically oversized hat I could have possibly found for this. I'm not gonna lie, the netting is kind of growing on me though. Having the hat at a jaunty angle along with the veil, I'm feeling very sassy right now. I don't have like a particularly clever way of rounding it all off this week, but I will just take a second to advocate for black cats because it is National Black Cat Day. I adore black cats, and I know superstitions can be quite a personal thing, and some of them can be very obscure, very specific as well. But the ones about black cats, it's just, it's so stupid. And the fact that there is like the real life impact still to this day that black cats are not adopted or returned or in some cases mistreated, specifically for these like 100-year-old theories and stories that were fearmongered by other groups of people. I don't know, if I could adopt like all the black cats, I would. Also, I will just say, I know obviously the whole point of this particular day is to try and dispel the rumours and the myths and the associations with witches and witchcraft and that kind of thing. The look that I've chosen to do is very much not reinforcing, but playing on that association. But I wanted to look into and kind of tell the story of how this whole thing started. Let me know what you guys think. If you know anything else to do with like superstitions around black cats or any particular mythology that is linked to cats or black cats, let me know, because I would genuinely be really interested to see it. The start of this research was kind of all over the place, if I'm honest. If you do have a black cat, please let me know their names. What do we think of the mythology regarding black cats and their association with witches and witchcraft and all things bad luck, but also good luck? Let me know what you think of the look as well. Thank you so much for joining me for this week and for your just kind of general support throughout October. From next week, I will be going back to regular monsters and myths rather than spooky specific ones. So self-promo moment for a second, but make sure you are subscribed, notifications on, all that stuff, just so that you don't miss any of the uploads. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I appreciate you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.